July 5, 1865. A humid morning settles over Washington, heavy with the stench of ink sweat and gunpowder long dried. Inside the executive mansion, silence holds its breath. Only the scratching of a pen, deliberate, unhurried, breaks the air. President Andrew Johnson, successor to a murdered leader, bends over parchment bearing the Great Seal of the United States. His eyes are dark-rimmed, sleepless from the war that refused to end even after the cannon stopped. The paper before him is not just another order, it is a sentence of death. At exactly 10:15 a.m., his pen touches the page. The nib hesitates, then moves one stroke, then another. The ink blooms like blood on linen. 4 names fixed forever beneath his hand: David E. Harold, George Atzerodt, Louis Payne, Mary E. Surratt. Outside, soldiers march across the Arsenal Yard, boots striking rhythm with the same grim certainty as the president's pen. The war had claimed 500,000 lives, yet the nation demanded more. Demanded justice, or perhaps vengeance. No one speaks when the order is sealed, no prayer, no hesitation. The warrant will travel that night under armed escort to the gallows already built in the courtyard of the old Arsenal prison. Beneath the July sun, the wood still smells of pine and resin, freshly cut, unweathered, waiting. Witnesses later recalled the president's hand trembling slightly as he signed, not from doubt, but exhaustion. One aide whispered that his lips moved, forming silent words. Perhaps a name. No one dared to ask whose. Some said the air in that room was colder than the rest of the house, that even the curtains hung still as if time itself refused to breathe. Others swore they heard a faint knock at the far door, 3 soft taps evenly spaced, like the echo of a hammer striking a coffin nail. By evening, couriers carried the order through muddy streets. The document bore the presidential seal and the weight of the Republic's grief. The people would have their justice swift and visible. But in the shadows of the prison yard, something else lingered. Unease. Mary Surratt, the boarding house keeper accused of sheltering the conspirators, sat alone in her cell, a rosary wound tight around her fingers, her breath shallow against the iron bars. She whispered that she was innocent, that she had only offered kindness to men who came and went. No one believed her. Louis Payne, tall, cold-eyed, once a Confederate soldier, stared at the wall. He had tried to kill Secretary Seward with a knife, failing only by inches. When guards passed, he smiled. "They can hang me," he said softly, "but they can't hang the truth." George Atzerodt, the carriage painter turned would-be assassin, wept, his confession scattered between fear and guilt. David Harold, the youngest, merely begged to see his mother. 4 lives, 4 signatures, 1 pen. That night Johnson slept fitfully. His dreams were said to be haunted by voices indistinct, pleading the murmur of the nation he swore to reunite. Outside, the Potomac carried moonlight like molten silver, silent beneath the gallows that waited. And so began one of the most chilling mornings in American history, when justice and retribution shared the same rope. The ink was still wet, the wood was still clean, and by the next sunrise 4 hearts would no longer beat. Washington, July 1865. A capital stitched together by grief and gun smoke. The air still carried the scent of gun oil, the cries of victory parades fading into uneasy quiet. Blue uniforms filled the streets, soldiers who had fought their last battle yet could not find peace. The war was over, they said, but the blood had not dried. The newspapers still trembled in the hands of printers, each headline shouting of assassins, conspiracies, vengeance. Execution to proceed. One read the ink smudged by the sweat of the typesetter. Children ran barefoot past lampposts plastered with portraits of Lincoln, their faces half torn by rain and time. At night the city flickered between mourning and rage, gaslight glowing against the black cloth that draped every window. The courthouse stood like a fortress of justice, though its walls whispered of doubt. Across the river, the old Arsenal prison loomed, part military depot, part graveyard of the living. Behind its iron gates, 8 conspirators waited under constant guard. Each cell was small enough to touch both walls with outstretched arms. The guards were ordered not to speak to the prisoners, not to listen to them, not to answer their questions. Silence was the law. The war had birthed strange loyalties and stranger fears. Some still toasted the Confederacy in hidden rooms. Others prayed for vengeance to wash the Capitol clean. Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat thrust into Lincoln's unfinished war for unity, now held the power to decide who would die for treason. Every decision, every signature a knife's edge between mercy and order. At the War Department, Secretary Edwin Stanton moved like a man possessed. His beard bristled, his eyes burned with sleepless conviction. He had built the tribunal chosen, the judges silenced the rumors. To him, this was not just punishment, it was preservation. The Republic could not afford doubt. He called it the machinery of justice. And so the machinery turned. Witnesses were summoned, cross-examined under oil lamps that burned deep into the night. Handwritten confessions, sometimes shaky, sometimes coerced, were filed in bundles stamped confidential. The military court sat under strict secrecy. Outside crowds gathered at dawn, their breath misting in the humid air, waiting for verdicts they would never read. Across the Potomac, life went on as if balanced on a thread. Freedmen searched for missing families torn apart by war. Soldiers without limbs begged beside the treasury gates. The smell of bread and horses mixed with the distant clang of ironwork, the rebuilding of a nation that wasn't sure it could forgive itself. Inside the prison yard, carpenters measured timber-planed beams and tested ropes. A gallows rose slowly under the relentless July sun, not hastily built, but deliberate, precise. Its posts were sunk deep into the earth as if to anchor the weight of what was coming. One soldier wrote in his diary, "They build it like a monument, not a machine of death." At the same hour, photographers from Matthew Brady's studio prepared their glass plates, aware that history itself was about to have its portrait taken. They set up tripods near the wall, adjusting their lenses, their silence thicker than the summer heat. Meanwhile, in the boarding house on H Street, where Mary Surratt had once served meals to men now called assassins, her daughter Anna knelt before an empty chair, her mother's rosary coiled like a noose in her palms. She would later testify that her mother was innocent, that she was framed by hysteria and hatred. But history by then had stopped listening. The public thirsted for finality. Justice had to look like justice. It had to be seen, heard, and photographed. The wounds of the nation demanded witnesses. Every citizen was both juror and mourner. And yet beneath the surface, doubt lingered. Even in Congress, quiet voices questioned the legality of a military tribunal judging civilians. Was it justice, one senator murmured, or the fever of revenge disguised as law? But the wind carried their words away over rooftops draped in mourning cloth, through streets where soldiers sang songs of victory that no one quite believed. In the evenings, when the heat lifted, the city would hush. The bells of St. Aloysius tolled slow and low. Fireflies flickered above the Potomac, drifting like lost spirits. Inside the prison, lanterns burned past midnight. Guards reported faint weeping from Mary Surratt's cell. Not loud, not broken, just a steady whisper. They said it sounded like prayer, or resignation. By July 5th, the order had been signed. Couriers galloped across the bridge carrying the sealed warrant. The iron gates creaked open for them, closing again with a sound that echoed like a verdict. In the cells, the condemned stirred, unaware that history had already decided their fate. Outside, Washington slept fitfully. A storm gathered somewhere beyond the horizon, silent for now, waiting to break. And when dawn came, bright merciless, the gallows stood ready. The city that had watched a president die was about to watch justice hang in his name. The ropes had been tested. The crowd was forming. The hour was near. The courtroom inside the old Arsenal prison was unlike any other in America. It was a place where silence carried the weight of verdicts, where the air itself seemed to listen. The heat of July pressed through the windows, but the soldiers who guarded the doors didn't move. They stood like marble muskets, polished eyes hollow. Behind them, 8 wooden chairs faced a long table draped in army green. On those chairs sat the accused men, and one woman waiting to be remembered forever as conspirators in the killing of a president. Their names had already been printed across the nation. David E. Harold Lewis Payne, George Atzerodt, Mary E. Surratt, Michael O'Laughlin, Edward Spangler, Samuel Arnold, Samuel A. Mudd. Some were barely more than boys. Some had fought for the Confederacy. All of them were bound, watched, and written into history. At the head of the table sat the military commission, 9 officers in Union blue. Their buttons gleamed like eyes under the gaslight. Above them, a large American flag hung limp, its folds heavy with dust. The courtroom smelled of paper and sweat and something older like iron rust and fear. Each day began the same. The court crier's voice cracked through the heat. Hear ye, the military commission convenes by order of the President of the United States. A scratch of quills followed the sound of men recording history line by line as if truth could be trapped in ink. The evidence came in waves: maps, pistols, ropes, coded letters, fragments of a conspiracy that spread like smoke. Witnesses took the stand: soldiers, clerks, servants, a theater stagehand, who swore he saw John Wilkes Booth rehearsing his lines before the shot was fired. Each testimony carried a heartbeat of disbelief. How could a single bullet at Ford's Theater unravel an entire nation? How could these ordinary faces be architects of such darkness? Lewis Payne sat unmoving through it all. His hair fell into his eyes, his hands were chained. When asked if he had stabbed Secretary Seward, he looked at the judge and said softly, "I did what I was told. No tremor, no remorse." The words landed like stones dropped into a deep well, and the silence that followed felt endless. Mary Surratt's veil hid her face. The prosecution painted her as the mother of treason, the keeper of the boarding house where the conspirators met. Her defense argued she was nothing more than a widow caught in a storm not of her making. Yet the crowd outside hissed her name in the dark: traitor, witch, murderer. David Harold wept often, muttering prayers, clutching the rail as though it could hold back the noose. He had fled with Booth through the swamps of Maryland, guided him by lantern light after the gunshot that shook the nation. When captured, he begged not to be separated from his friend the assassin who was already dead. George Atzerodt confessed his cowardice. He had been ordered to kill Vice President Johnson at the Kirkwood House Hotel, but drank himself senseless instead. "I could not do it," he whispered. "I am no killer." The guards didn't look at him. The trial lasted 7 weeks, 7 long weeks in a city haunted by grief. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, their pens trembling under the eyes of Stanton's guards. Sketch artists captured every frown, every flicker of candlelight across Mary Surratt's black dress. Outside the gates, people gathered each day, desperate for whispers. Some prayed, others cursed. All waited for the hammer to fall. As the testimony grew darker, the air in the courtroom thickened. A soldier swore that the night before the assassination he heard Booth say, "That man's death is our last victory." Another recalled a letter written in invisible ink, a plan to strike the government in its heart. But there were inconsistencies, gaps, ghostly absences. Witnesses contradicted each other. Evidence vanished between sessions. One clerk later confessed that papers were misfiled or perhaps destroyed. The line between truth and vengeance blurred until no one could tell which side of the rope they stood on. The folklore of Washington began to twist around the trial. Women claimed to see Booth's ghost in the theater balcony, a pale figure standing beneath the flag, his shadow flickering when the gaslights dimmed. Others swore they heard the clink of chains echoing near the arsenal walls, as if the condemned were already rehearsing their final steps. In the evenings after the court adjourned, soldiers said the courtroom itself grew colder. The ink on the ledgers would not dry. Candles burned shorter than they should. Some refused to guard the night shift, saying the cells whispered not the prisoners, but the air itself. On June 30th, 1865, the verdicts were read. Harold, Atzerodt, Payne, and Surratt guilty and sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead. The others were given life in prison or hard labor. Mary Surratt fainted when she heard the words. A guard caught her before she hit the floor. She whispered, "I am innocent, as God is my witness." The chaplain placed a cross in her hand. The officers did not look up. 5 days later, the papers were brought to the White House. The president would decide whether mercy still had a place in a wounded republic. Johnson read the files slowly, every word, every plea for clemency. Some say he paused longest at Mary Surratt's name. Some say he didn't pause at all. He reached for the pen, and with a single motion sealed the fate of 4 souls. The city outside never knew the exact hour of his decision. They only felt it, a stillness that swept the streets the way air changes before thunder. By nightfall, the gallows stood ready, veiled in canvas. The witnesses were chosen, the soldiers rehearsed, the executioner tested the ropes. Washington slept beneath the weight of justice and the murmurs of the condemned. The ink was dry, the verdict was done. The next sunrise would be their last. Night fell slowly over Washington, thick and airless, the kind of night that pressed against the skin and stayed there. The city, exhausted from war and judgment, exhaled in uneasy silence. Beyond the Potomac, the Arsenal prison stood like a black silhouette against a half-moon sky. Lanterns glowed faintly through barred windows, flickering as if the light itself feared to linger. Inside time had stopped. In one corridor, a guard named Corporal Dunn scratched the date into his rifle stock, July 6, 1865. He would later say it was the longest night of his life. You could hear them breathe, he wrote in a letter home, and the chains moving like rain tapping on iron. The sound traveled down the stone hallway, a rhythm steady, human, and final. At the far end of that corridor, behind thick wooden doors, 4 prisoners waited. Their cells were small, their ceilings low. A candle flickered in each, not for mercy, but for light enough to write final words. Mary Surratt sat at a narrow desk, her rosary coiled beside an open Bible. Her hands trembled as she wrote, not from fear, but from something colder. Resignation. Her voice, faint but steady, whispered prayers that hung in the stale air. Outside her door, the chaplain waited. Reverend Abram Gillette, the prison's final comfort. He carried communion wine in a small tin cup, his fingers shaking as he poured. "They tell me the president would not hear my petition," she murmured. "Then may God hear it instead." Down the corridor, Lewis Payne, or Lewis Powell as his mother had named him, sat with his wrists bound. His eyes were calm, almost detached. A soldier once he understood the ritual of death. When the chaplain entered, Payne looked up and said, "Do not pity me, Father. I have looked into worse faces than my own." The chaplain offered him prayer. Payne refused. "My prayers are finished," he said. "Let me rest." Yet his gaze followed the candle flame, and for the first time that night his breath shook. David Harold, the youngest, could not sit still. He whispered to himself, pacing in short steps between the cot and the wall. "Tell my mother I tried. Tell her I prayed." He pressed his face against the bars, searching the corridor for a friendly voice. None came. The guards had orders: no speech, no comfort, only silence. George Atzerodt lay curled on his bunk, weeping quietly. He had written his last confession hours before, shaky lines blotched with tears. "I was weak," he wrote, "not wicked." The guards took the note to the clerk, who sealed it without reading. The prison clock struck 11. The warden entered, hat in hand, flanked by soldiers with dim lanterns. They walked cell to cell, speaking softly. "Midnight soon. Prepare yourselves." The condemned nodded or didn't. The words fell like dust in the air. In the courtyard below, carpenters worked under torchlight. The sound of hammers echoed up the walls, steady, cruel, unhurried. They were building the steps, the ones that would lead from the scaffold floor to eternity. The ropes tested earlier in the day now hung coiled like sleeping serpents. Each was labeled with a name. One soldier assigned to guard duty near the gallows later wrote, "When the night wind came off the river, it made the ropes move just a little, swaying like they were alive." Some men laughed to break the spell. Others took off their caps and prayed. Past midnight, rain began to fall, thin, reluctant drops tapping on the iron roof. The air smelled of wet pine and smoke. From her cell, Mary Surratt asked for her black veil. Her daughter had sent it earlier that day, folded with a note she would never see. She placed the veil on the table beside her Bible, then knelt one last time. Elsewhere in his office, Warden General Hartranft reviewed the execution orders for the 100th time. The candle beside him guttered smoke, curling like a ghost around the papers. He paused when he reached Mary's name, then signed beneath it, "To be executed between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, July 7, 1865. He blew out the candle and sat in darkness. At 2 a.m., the chaplains moved between the cells, offering final rites. The condemned received them with uneven hearts. Some whispered the Lord's Prayer. Others stared at the floor. Payne said nothing. When the priest left, he smiled faintly and murmured, "I sleep easy." But no one believed him. Guards reported strange quiet near dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and still. Somewhere in the prison yard, a dog barked once, twice, then fell silent. By 4 a.m., soldiers assembled in formation. Drummers checked their sticks. The photographer prepared his plates, adjusting the brass fittings of his large camera beneath a black cloth. The gallows stood pale in the first gray light, its timbers slick from rain, its ropes dark with dew. Inside, the prisoners were given breakfast, bread, coffee, water. None ate. Mary Surratt asked for her cross. Payne asked for nothing. Harold cried quietly until a guard told him to stop. Atzerodt whispered that he deserved it. The chaplain's Bible shook in his hands as he read, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." His voice cracked on the word shadow. At sunrise, the guards opened the cell doors. The condemned emerged one by one, blinking against the light. They were dressed in dark coats, their wrists bound with white cloth. Mary walked first, leaning on the arm of a soldier. She did not cry. Her lips moved in prayer. When they reached the courtyard, the gallows loomed ahead, a silhouette of wooden beams against the morning sky. The crowd beyond the walls was already gathering, silent, breathless. A soldier later wrote, "It was as if the whole city stood holding its breath." They mounted the steps slowly. The boards creaked, the ropes waited. The priests followed, whispering final benedictions, drowned by the rising wind. No one spoke when the hoods were brought forward. No one looked away when the ropes were placed around their necks. The last thing Mary Surratt said was a whisper, barely a word. "Don't let them hurt me." The guards stepped back, and then nothing moved, except the clouds. July 7, 1865. The sky was pale gray, not yet blue, not yet warm. Dawn crawled over Washington like a slow, reluctant ghost. The river shimmered silent, as if it too waited for the hour. Inside the Arsenal prison, every door had been opened, every step measured. Soldiers stood in rows, bayonets, gleaming boots, sunk in dust, still damp from the night's rain. At 10 o'clock sharp, the courtyard filled with the sound of marching. The condemned appeared 4 figures moving slowly under heavy escort, their hands tied, their faces hidden behind calm that wasn't peace. Mary Surratt first veiled small, her black dress brushing the wood of the scaffold as she climbed. Louis Payne followed tall and steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. George Atzerodt, next, pale, trembling eyes swollen from weeping. David Harold, last whispering prayers no one could hear. Over 1,000 spectators waited beyond the prison walls. Soldiers, reporters, government clerks, curious citizens holding handkerchiefs against the heat. The crowd's murmur died as the prisoners mounted the gallows. There were no cries, no jeers, no mercy. Only the quiet rustle of wind through canvas and rope. Major General Hartranft stood beside the platform, the official in charge. In his pocket, the president's signed order folded heavy with ink and authority. He removed it once more, unfolded the parchment, and read the words aloud. The sentences of death are hereby approved and ordered to be carried into effect between the hours of 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock on Friday, the 7th day of July, 1865. When he finished, no one moved. The chaplain stepped forward, offering last prayers. Reverend Gillette spoke softly to Mary Surratt, his voice trembling. "May Christ receive your soul." She closed her eyes beneath the veil. Another minister asked if any had final words. Harold's lips shook. "I want to see my mother." Atzerodt mumbled something lost in the wind. Payne said nothing. His silence was its own confession. The hangman adjusted each noose carefully, almost gently, the ropes creaking as they tightened. Around each neck a white hood was drawn. The prisoners stood in line, feet on wooden traps that looked like the mouths of graves. A sergeant called out, "Stand back." The crowd beyond the wall held its breath. A clock struck 12, and then a single signal, the sharp clap of the hangman's hands. The trapdoors fell. 4 bodies dropped in unison, a sound like thunder cracking wood. The ropes snapped taut, sudden, absolute. For a moment, time broke. The soldiers flinched. The chaplains bowed their heads. The photographer, Alexander Gardner, pressed his shutter, capturing the instant when life and history crossed. The image would travel the world, frozen in silver, and silence, 4 silhouettes suspended against the empty sky. Mary's body swayed gently. Her veil fluttered. Her hands, bound in white, hung still. The others jerked the ropes, twisting the gallows, creaking beneath their weight. The doctor waited 12 minutes before declaring them dead. The sound of the crowd returned slowly, like the tide whispers, gasps, the rustle of skirts, the clink of bayonets. A few soldiers crossed themselves, others turned away. No one cheered. In his diary, one witness wrote, "It was justice, perhaps, but it felt like sorrow wearing a mask." The bodies hung there for half an hour, a warning carved against the morning sky. The sun broke through clouds, lighting the faces under the hoods. Someone said it looked like dawn refusing to rise. When they were cut down, the executioners laid them side by side on wooden planks. The ropes were coiled neatly at their feet. The hoods were removed one by one. Reporters described their faces in cold precision, Harold's lips still open, Atzerott's eyes half closed, Payne's features calm, Mary's expression almost serene. A physician stepped forward, recording the time of death, 12:45, he said. Another soldier noted the names on small tags pinned to each body. History became paperwork once more. The 4 coffins waited near the wall, plain pine boxes lined with white cloth. Soldiers lifted each body and lowered it gently like men afraid to wake the dead. The lids were nailed shut. The hammers echoed across the courtyard, each strike sounding like punctuation, the end of a chapter no one wanted to read again. Outside the prison, the crowd began to drift away. Women held handkerchiefs over their mouths. A child dropped a toy soldier in the dust and didn't pick it up. The heat thickened. The flies came. The air smelled of pine sweat and something faintly metallic, the scent that lingers after thunder. In the afternoon, the coffins were buried in shallow graves near the arsenal wall. No prayers, no songs, only the scrape of shovels and the rustle of uniforms. Guards stood in the sun, their shadows long, their faces unreadable. A few said they heard voices faint echoing from the gallows wood. The carpenters swore they felt the scaffold tremble once long after the ropes were cut. That night the prison returned to its silence. The gallows stood empty, the ropes removed. Only dark stains marked where the feet had brushed the platform. The river below moved slowly, its surface broken by ripples that glinted like fragments of broken glass. In the White House, President Johnson received confirmation the executions were carried out. He read the telegram without emotion, set it aside, and poured himself a drink. Outside his window, the city glowed with candlelight, not celebration, not mourning, just stillness. Some believed justice had been served. Others whispered that something in the act had cursed the city, that the ghosts of the executed lingered in the arsenal walls. For years afterward, guards reported strange knocks at night, 3 evenly spaced like the echo of the gallows' fall. But that morning, July 7th, the Republic had drawn its line, and when the rope swung still, the nation told itself that the war at last was over. Yet the air never felt clean again, and the shadow of the gallows never left Washington, because justice, once carried out in haste, never truly ends. It just waits in silence for history to remember. By the evening of July 7th, the sky over Washington burned the color of copper. The heat did not lift. It pressed down on the city like a hand refusing to release its grip. Inside the arsenal walls, the sawdust had already been swept. The gallows stood bare, its timbers stripped, its ropes cut away. Soldiers carried the beams into storage. Some said they would be reused, others swore they should be burned. But the officers ordered otherwise. Keep it, they said. History may need it again. The crowd that had witnessed the executions dispersed slowly, faces gray and silent. Reporters hurried to telegraph offices, their hands trembling as they typed. The first lines flashed across the wires before sunset. The assassins of President Lincoln have paid the penalty. Justice is complete. The Republic avenged. Yet behind those headlines, the air of Washington felt heavier than triumph. The soldiers in the yard drank in silence. Even the photographers who had captured the hanging refused to speak of it that night. Alexander Gardner developed his plates in a dim studio, watching the images appear, pale faces beneath white hoods, bodies suspended midair. History has no pulse, he muttered to his assistant, only shadows. At the White House, President Johnson received a note from Secretary Stanton. The execution concluded without disorder. That was all. No sentiment, no reflection. Johnson folded it once and locked it away. Then he turned to his desk, where another pile of petitions waited, pardons, appointments, claims. The machinery of government moved on, indifferent to ghosts. But not everyone could forget. The morning after, a young corporal assigned to guard duty near the graves refused to eat. He told the chaplain he'd heard voices at dawn, soft, indistinct, as if someone beneath the earth was praying. The chaplain told him it was imagination. Yet the corporal requested transfer within the week. Down in the arsenal's lower storerooms, carpenters found that the boards used for the scaffold had warped overnight. They said the wood was cursed. One plank bore 4 indentations, small and shallow marks where the ropes had bitten into the grain. No one touched it again. In the city, the newspapers sold faster than bread. People tore them open in the streets, eyes rushing to the details, the drop, the faces, the final words. Some called it justice divine. Others whispered that hanging a woman, the first in federal history, was an act the Republic would regret. Mary Surratt's daughter Anna wandered from office to office, pleading for her mother's body. Soldiers turned her away. Orders, they said. She stood outside the prison gates until night fell, her black dress soaked in sweat and tears. The guards later said she prayed aloud, not for forgiveness, but for memory. In taverns and parlor rooms, conversation split the capital in two. One side toasted the end of treason. The other murmured about haste, about power wielded too quickly. Some wondered if the conspirators had truly deserved their fate, or if vengeance had simply needed faces. "Booth is dead," one man said at the bar of the Willard Hotel. The rest were the smoke that followed his gun. But justice once set in motion rarely stops where it begins. In the weeks that followed, the remaining prisoners, Arnold Mudd O'Loughlin and Spangler, were shipped to Fort Jefferson, a fortress adrift in the sea 700 miles from the mainland. Their chains clinked with every wave. O'Loughlin would die there of fever. Mudd would one day earn pardon for treating soldiers during an epidemic. The others would fade into history, their names footnotes beneath the greater tragedy. And yet Mary Surratt's story refused to rest. Her boarding house on H Street remained standing, the curtains drawn. Neighbors swore that sometimes after midnight they saw a light flicker in the upper window, as if someone still waited for clemency that never came. Decades later, when the building was turned into a tavern, patrons claimed to feel sudden chills near the staircase, the same steps soldiers once climbed to arrest her. The legend grew not of guilt or innocence, but of injustice unanswered. Her name became a wound that refused to heal. Writers argued her case for years, that she was a scapegoat, a mother sacrificed for a symbol. One historian would call her execution the shadow that hung over Reconstruction. Meanwhile, the photographs circulated. Gardner's images, stark, unblinking, traveled in newspapers across the country. For many Americans, it was the first time death had been captured with such calm precision. The picture of the hanging stood as both closure and mirror, a reminder that justice when photographed could never again be unseen. Some tore the papers apart in disgust, others framed the images like relics. In the War Department, Stanton ordered the negatives sealed. He understood their power. A picture, he said, can hang a nation. And yet the echoes continued. Years later, guards at the reconstructed arsenal, now an ordnance depot, reported hearing footsteps near the courtyard every July, always near noon, always 4 sets. One sergeant claimed to see the shadow of a woman in black standing by the wall, her head bowed. When he called out, she vanished, leaving only the faint scent of candle wax. By the 1880s, the graves were quietly exhumed. The bones were moved to private cemeteries. Mary's coffin was opened for identification, the skull still veiled in remnants of cloth. The soldiers who lifted it later refused to speak of what they saw. The undertaker said the air inside the coffin was cool, like the breath of stone. But history has a way of softening its edges. In time, the trial became a paragraph. The names became trivia. The gallows, dismantled and forgotten, was said to have been cut into pieces, some used for firewood, some for relics. A rumor persisted that one plank remained under lock, buried in the archives, still smelling faintly of resin and rain. Yet the city itself remembered. The arsenal, later renamed Fort McNair, stood on the same ground. And on quiet mornings when the Potomac mist rolled low, soldiers said the air turned cold at the hour of execution. The bugle sounded different there, slower, softer, as if echoing something older. The war was long over. The Union was whole again. But beneath the marble monuments and new parades that day, July 7th lingered like a shadow stitched into the nation's flag. Because justice in its truest form demands peace after punishment. And peace never came. Only silence, the kind that hums beneath the surface of history, reminding those who listen that even righteousness can leave ghosts behind. The papers stopped printing her name. The city built over its sorrow. But each year the wind still passes through that courtyard, carrying the faint rhythm of ropes once swinging in the morning sun. Time has a way of softening edges, of turning blood to ink and ink to dust, but some pages refuse to fade. Today the old Arsenal prison is gone, its walls replaced by manicured lawns and offices, its gallows long dismantled. Yet the ground remembers. Beneath the soil of what is now Fort McNair, 4 graves once rested, unmarked, unnamed, their locations kept quiet to avoid pilgrimage or protest. Each July, the river still carries a strange calm across the shore, the same stillness that lingered on that morning in 1865. The surviving documents, the transcripts of the tribunal, the execution orders, the president's signature now rest in the National Archives. Their ink, still dark, has not surrendered to time. The handwriting trembles on the parchment as if the hand that wrote it never stopped shaking. You can read them still, the same words that sealed the fate of 4 human beings in the name of justice. Each letter bleeds authority and hesitation. In 1869, President Andrew Johnson left office uncelebrated, nearly forgotten. His act of approval for the execution remained the single decision historians would never forgive and never agree upon. Was it justice served or justice hurried? He would insist in his memoirs that he acted by law. But law after war is a fragile thing. The debate continued for generations. Mary Surratt's guilt or innocence became one of America's earliest courtroom hauntings. Law students still read her case, tracing the signatures and contradictions, studying the line between civilian and military authority. Even the Supreme Court in later rulings quietly admitted what the tribunal had ignored, that civilians should not be tried by soldiers. Too late for her. Some historians called the hangings a necessary wound, a scar that sealed the Union's fracture. Others called it a mirror reflecting a nation that demanded justice faster than it could define it. Each essay, each lecture, each book written since then feels like another hand reaching into that July morning, trying to touch the truth before it disappears again. And yet, the truth is not always found in paper. It lingers elsewhere. In the Library of Congress, among the brittle diaries of soldiers and clerks, one page catches the eye. Written in faded pencil, unsigned. The rope creaked after the last breath. It sounded like a whisper. "Is it finished?" I could not answer. That line, fragile, uncertain, feels closer to history than any official record. Decades passed. The photographs of the execution, once hidden, resurfaced. Gardner's haunting glass plates, clear and merciless, were displayed in exhibits titled "The Price of Treason." Visitors stared at them in silence. Some lingered too long, unable to look away. The past, once frozen in silver, looked back. At the Smithsonian, curators occasionally bring the tribunal records to light, showing students the precise folds of paper, the imprints of seals, the faint fingerprint of a clerk who touched history and left it marked. Nearby, a small plaque reads, "On this ground, 4 conspirators were executed July 7, 1865. Their guilt decided by men, their silence kept by time." No ghosts appear, no lights flicker, just the quiet hum of air conditioning, the distant shuffle of tourists, the soft buzz of history refusing to rest. But if you stand in that courtyard at dusk where the Potomac breeze still drifts through the grass, you might feel something. A hush, a density in the air, not cold, not menacing, but aware. The sound of boots on gravel, maybe, or the faint echo of a prayer whispered through cloth. Some say it's imagination, others say memory. Each July, small groups gather historians, reenactors, the curious. They read the names aloud. They speak not of vengeance but of consequence. They read the letter written by Anna Surratt begging for her mother's body. They read Paine's final words. They read the official warrant dated July 5th, signed in ink that still glistens under light. And then they fall silent, because history once spoken aloud fills every corner of the air. The gallows are gone. The rope is dust. But the questions remain the same ones asked in that courtroom beneath that flag, under that July sun. What does justice owe the living? And what debt does it pay to the dead? When vengeance wears the face of law, does the law still see clearly? And when a nation silences its ghosts, do they ever truly leave? There is no answer in the record. Only the sound of a pen scratching across parchment and the faint creak of wood above a July courtyard long vanished from sight. So when you walk through Washington today, past monuments of marble, past flags raised in triumph, remember that beneath the city's calm there are still echoes, voices that never had their verdict. They belong to the nation's first haunted hour after peace, the moment justice found its reflection in the gallows. And somewhere in the archive's dim light, that file still rests, its title faded, its seal unbroken, its silence waiting for someone to listen. You have just heard a story from the part of history that never sleeps. One file among many that history never closed. Stay curious and keep listening.